Another dichotomy that I wanted to bring up was this idea of training versus no training in an artist. And I sigh because it's this constant debate amongst artists and amongst people who like to critique art as to whether good training is a help or a hindrance. I did some apprenticeship work under an artist, a fine artist from Moscow. So as a 13-year-old, I picked up some draftsmanship skills, and I considered that very valuable. But my father pulled me out of those classes because those workshops. My father felt that the very dark colors that the particular artist I was working with had been trained in would perhaps stifle my own personal style. So even in my own family, there's been this debate as to whether training is a good thing or training is like denuding you of your vitality as an artist. So I want to read a couple of things that the biographer said. Okay, page 33. This is talking about whether Mary Cassatt should go to art school or not. And there was a whole debate about whether young women should be educated in that day, whether an education makes a happier wife or not. And these are all debates that are still going on in our world. But as to whether or not an artistic training is of use, this is what the author wrote, the biographer. Quote, "On the other hand, lack of training was the ruin of more talented beginners than talented beginners were ruined by training." I love it. End quote. I'll read it again. "On the other hand, lack of training was the ruin of more talented beginners than talented beginners were ruined by lack of training." To continue, an even obliquely representative painter was hamstrung who attempted a subject only to find himself unequipped to execute it. The early paintings of Degas reveal how he barely skirted the verge of failure. Degas, Manet, even Cézanne, even Picasso had training in technique which then became theirs to use or to knowingly abuse. Mary Cassatt would not have begun to attract the attention of Degas in the Paris Salon, as she did attract it, if she had not known the grammar of art and its vocabulary. How to set up a figure anatomically, how to draw accurately, how to prepare canvas, handle charcoal and pastel, matter-of-fact equipment, and insufficient for getting beyond first base as an artist. But for want of these nails, many a horse that might have been winged was lost. Never heard that phrase before. But for want of these nails, many a horse that might have been winged was lost. Conversely, an untalented painter, though he may have indeed like a voice, remained fresher without training, was never stronger, for lack of knowledge of what he was doing. End quote. So I really appreciated that because I have a lot of respect for how-to manuals and craft work shops in craft spaces. I have a lot of respect for the smithery of the wordsmith, the grinding down of pigment and the mixing of your own colors. I feel like there are a lot of lessons that can be gained in that, and I hear a lot of arguments that we lose our freshness, we lose our voice if we don't have good training. Oh no, if we do have good training, people argue that we lose our sense of self. And there's a very thin line to walk there, like picking up all the skills and then knowing when to get out and become your own person. There's another bit here, though, where she goes on to discuss when to get out. Okay, page 51. So another art critic observes that even by 1877, when at last Mary Cassatt met Degas, she had not yet, quote, evolved a mode of painting in any way personal. She deliberately chose the long and difficult way. Above all, she felt that a painter should immerse themselves in an old master. Study, copy, emulate, end quote. And this is the bit where I feel that they touch on the delicate knowledge of knowing when to get out of training and when to be yourself. Avoiding the atelier kept her from becoming set in her ways at an early age. But it took her years to master the technique of painting. Nevertheless, the process was anything but timid or hesitant. It was not that kind of uncertainty, simply the pearl, nacreous and hard, which served Mary for a center, was growing, and Correggio in Parma was there to be plundered. Let's unpack some of that. This other art critic, his name is F.A. Sweet. I don't know what F.A. stands for, but if his first name was Sweet and his last initials were F.A., it'd be kind of funny. He argued that early on in her career, Mary Cassatt was like working too hard on the technique side of it and not adding any personal touch. But then escaping the workshop spaces of the atelier helped her from becoming too set in those ways. And she went to Parma in Italy to work from Correggio, to immerse herself in the old masters, and thereby escaping, I guess, a kind of rigid practice. Emulating the best, she was able to then move on to her own self. There's a lot that goes on in the art world as to whether you should be a part of a group of artists or whether you should be on your own, whether you can learn from others or whether you start to emulate them too much and you lose your own style, your own handwriting. I appreciated that the biographer wanted to talk a little bit about this. These are all debates that I worry about as an artist and as someone who enjoys learning and wants to pursue training, and wants to be part of a group like an atelier, but not always knowing if it's the right thing to do. Okay, another dichotomy that the biographer talks about is another one that I think about a lot. And that's because I write and illustrate children's books, so I tend to work on illustrating big ideas. That's kind of my wheelhouse. Philosophy for kids, medical diagnoses for kids. So I think a lot about the difference between fine art and illustrative art, and I consider myself an illustrator. However, I'm starting to do some fine art commissions and some fine art projects, and it's making me question the difference between what it is to be a fine artist and what it is to be an illustrator of a book. So I appreciated on page 37 when the biographer talked about the difference between serious artists and illustrators.